John, a 32-year-old man, had recently moved to a quiet and cozy neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Tired of the busy and noisy city life, he had come to this neighborhood in search of peace. He had bought a 2-story house with a brick facade and a small but charming yard. The first days of moving in passed with happiness and hope for a peaceful future. A week into John's stay in the new house, he noticed strange behaviors from his neighbor, a middle-aged man who lived in the house next door, whom John hadn't yet had the chance to meet. The man was often awake late into the night, and the sound of his heavy footsteps could be heard from the yard. Sometimes, incomprehensible murmurs could be heard from behind the wall, causing John to wake up in fear. Gradually, John noticed that his neighbor had other unusual behaviors. For example, every night at 11 o'clock sharp, he would turn off the lights in his house and then turn them on again after a few minutes. He would repeat this 3 times. John tried to convince himself that this was just a strange habit, but deep down, he had an unpleasant feeling. One night while John was watching TV, a terrible scream was heard from the neighbor's house. John jumped up in fear and ran to the window. From behind the curtain, he saw the shadow of a man running in the neighbor's yard. His heart was pounding. He didn't know what to do. Should he call the police? But what if he was mistaken? After a few minutes, everything calmed down, and no more sounds were heard. John couldn't sleep until morning. The next day, John decided to talk to his neighbor. With fear and trembling, he went towards his house and pressed the doorbell. After a moment, a middle-aged man with a tired face and red eyes opened the door. John introduced himself and said he had just moved to the neighborhood. The man invited him in with an artificial smile. The neighbor's house had a strange smell, a combination of dampness and something like rotten meat. John tried not to pay attention. The neighbor, who introduced himself as Mr. Rezai, started talking. He spoke about his work and life, how his wife had died a few years ago, and he had been living alone since then. John wanted to ask about last night's scream, but he didn't dare. Meanwhile, John's eye caught a picture on the wall. It was a photo of a young and beautiful woman smiling. Mr. Rezai noticed John's gaze and said, "This is my wife. I miss her so much." The tone of his voice was as if he had lost his wife just yesterday. John, feeling uncomfortable, decided to say goodbye and leave. But just as he was about to exit, he heard a faint sound from the basement, a sound like a moan or cry. His heart started racing. Mr. Rezai quickly said, "Oh, it must be the cats. They sometimes come into the basement." But his voice was anxious and his hands were shaking. John hurriedly left the house and returned to his own home. His mind was full of questions. Was it really the sound of cats? Or was there something else in that basement? He decided to go to the police station tomorrow and tell the story. That night, John had a strange dream. In the dream, he saw himself in the basement of Mr. Rezai's house, a dark and damp room full of cages. In each cage, a human was imprisoned, looking at him with eyes full of terror. The sound of their moans and pleas filled the space. John woke up in horror, cold sweat on his forehead. The next morning, John went to the police station and told them everything. He talked about the neighbors' suspicious behaviors, the nightly screams, and even the dream he had. The police officer listened carefully to his words and promised to investigate the matter. 2 days later, when John was returning home from work, he noticed that several police cars were parked in front of Mr. Rezai's house. His heart started racing. As he got closer, he saw several police officers bringing something out of the house, something that looked like a body wrapped in a white cloth. John was staring at the scene in horror. One of the police officers came towards him and said, "Are you John? The one who reported?" John nodded. The officer continued, "Unfortunately, you were right. We found several bodies in Mr. Rezai's basement. It appears he was a serial killer who had been secretly continuing his crimes for years." John felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. All this time, he had been living next door to a killer. The police officer continued, "We arrested Mr. Rezai. He confessed that since his wife's death, he had started killing women who looked like his wife. He kept them in the basement and..." John couldn't hear anymore. He felt nauseous. He quickly ran towards his house and closed the door behind him. His heart was pounding. Horrible images were passing through his mind. That scream, that strange smell in Mr. Rezai's house, that faint sound from the basement. Everything made sense now. If you enjoyed it so far, please hit the subscribe button if you liked the video. John couldn't leave the house for several days. Every time he looked at the neighbor's house, horror filled his entire being. The thought that he had been living next to such a monster all this time was driving him crazy. Gradually, the news of this horrible crime spread throughout the neighborhood and even the city. Reporters had come from everywhere to report on the neighbor killer. John was constantly being questioned. Everyone wanted to know how he had noticed and why he had suspected. One night, when John was sitting at home trying to distract his mind from this incident, he heard a knock at the door. He fearfully went towards the door and looked through the peephole. He saw a woman standing behind the door. With hesitation, he opened the door. The woman introduced herself. "Hello. I'm the sister of one of Mr. Rezai's victims. I wanted to thank you. If it wasn't for you, we might never have known what happened to my sister." John didn't know what to say. He felt like his throat was being squeezed. The woman continued, "I know this experience has been horrible for you too, but you saved many lives. If Mr. Rezai hadn't been arrested, who knows how many more victims there would have been." John nodded and whispered a thank you. After the woman left, John had a strange feeling. On one hand, he was still horrified by the thought of what had happened in the neighbor's house. On the other hand, he felt he had done the right thing. Perhaps if it wasn't for him, these horrible crimes would have continued. Days passed and gradually life in the neighborhood returned to normal. Mr. Rezai's house remained empty and no one dared to go near it. John shuddered every time he passed by that house. One night when John was returning home, he noticed that the door of Mr. Rezai's house was open. His heart started racing. Had someone entered the house? He hesitantly went towards the house. He could hear footsteps from inside. John knew he shouldn't enter, but his curiosity overcame his fear. He cautiously entered the house. It was dark everywhere. He lit up the surroundings with his mobile phone. The house was the same as he had last seen it, just a bit dustier. The sound of footsteps was coming from the basement. John knew he shouldn't go there, but it was as if a force was pulling him towards the basement. He went down the basement stairs with hesitation. With each step he took, his heart beat faster. The basement was dark and damp, just like in his dream. He shone his phone light around. The walls were full of scratches and strange marks. It was as if someone had written things on them with their nails. Suddenly he heard a rustling sound from a dark corner. John turned towards it in horror. His phone light fell on something that looked like a large cage. His heart stopped for a moment. Just like in his dream, there was a cage in the basement. With trembling steps, he went towards the cage. The closer he got, the faster his heart beat. When he reached the cage, his breath caught at what he saw inside. A large doll, similar to the woman he had seen in the picture on the wall of Mr. Rezai's house, was inside the cage. The doll seemed to be staring at him. John took a step back and his foot caught on something. He shone the light down and saw that the floor was full of bones, small and large bones, some white and some yellowed from the passage of time. Horror filled his entire being. He wanted to scream, but his voice was stuck in his throat. At that moment, he heard the creaking sound of the basement door. John quickly turned and saw that the basement door was slowly closing. He ran towards the door with all his might, but it was too late. The door closed with a loud sound, and he was plunged into complete darkness. John pounded on the door with his fists and screamed, but he knew no one could hear him. He picked up his phone to call the police, but realized he had no signal. He felt like the basement walls were getting closer and closer to him. It was becoming difficult for him to breathe. At that moment, he heard a soft laugh from behind him, a voice that was strangely familiar. He slowly turned, and in the dim light of his phone, he saw Mr. Rezai's face staring at him with a scary smile. John screamed in horror, But you should be in prison." Mr. Rezai laughed and said, "Oh, dear neighbor, did you think you could catch me that easily? I've been playing this game for years. Every time I was close to being caught, I found a way to escape. And now it's your turn to become part of my collection." John tried to escape, but his feet seemed glued to the ground. Mr. Rezai was slowly approaching him, while a sharp knife gleamed in his hand. John closed his eyes and waited for the end, but suddenly, there was a loud sound of glass breaking, and then the light from police flashlights illuminated the basement. The shout of "Police! Hands up!" filled the space. John opened his eyes and saw several police officers entering the basement with their guns ready. Mr. Reze, who had been caught off guard, tried to escape but was quickly arrested. One of the officers came towards John and asked, "Are you all right? We noticed you entered this house, and when we saw you didn't come out, we got worried." John, who was still in shock from recent events, just nodded his head. They took him out of the basement and placed him in an ambulance that was waiting outside. As they wrapped a blanket around him, he stared at the scene in front of him. Mr. Rezai was being put into a police car with handcuffs. The days and weeks that followed were like a long nightmare for John. Counseling sessions, police interrogations, and the endless curiosity of neighbors and media. But gradually, with the help of a counselor and the support of friends and family, he was able to overcome this horrific experience. A year later, John decided to sell his house and move to another city. On moving day, as he was putting his last belongings in the truck, he glanced at Mr. Rezai's house, a house that now looked abandoned and scary. A shiver ran down his spine. On the way to his new home, John thought about how much his life had changed in the span of a year. He now knew that sometimes the scariest monsters are those who live in our neighborhood and smile at us. But he had also learned that courage and vigilance can be life-saving, even in the darkest moments. John vowed to himself never to let fear dominate his life. He was now stronger and more aware than before, ready for a fresh start in a new city. But he knew he would never forget that night in the basement of Mr. Rezai's house, and the lesson he had learned from it.